I'm Clara Bennett, 32 years old, and I thought my wedding day would finally be the moment my family stood with me. But when the music began and I looked over, 4 full rows of chairs were empty, reserved for the people who had raised me, the people who were supposed to love me most. They didn't come. Not my mother, not my father, not even my sister. I told myself I could endure their silence until the photograph surfaced later that night. My sister was shining in a white dress of her own, and around her neck hung the diamond necklace written into my grandmother's will for me. It was supposed to be mine. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about an empty chair or a missed toast. It was about betrayal deeper than I ever imagined. And by the time everything came to light, no one in my family would walk away untouched. Stay with me, because once you hear how it unfolded, you'll never forget it. The glass ceiling of the conservatory glittered in the early afternoon sun, casting fractured light across rows of white chairs draped with satin ribbons. The air smelled faintly of roses and gardenias, a sweetness layered over the quiet hum of anticipation. Guests turned their heads as the music began, the first notes of the string quartet drifting like something out of a dream. I held on to Michael's father's arm, ready to take the long walk down the aisle toward the man I loved. But as my eyes moved over the rows of chairs, my heart sank. 4 entire rows at the front, marked with small gold cards that read, "Reserved for the Bennett family," sat in complete silence. Empty. Not a single silhouette, not a familiar face. Just neat white cushions waiting for people who had decided I wasn't worth showing up for. I blinked hard, trying to steady myself, but the sting in my chest spread like fire. I had imagined Mom's perfume floating through the air, that heavy Chanel she wore even to the grocery store. I had pictured Dad's sharp cough laugh echoing when someone made a joke, even when it wasn't that funny. I had braced myself for Emily's pointed glance, the subtle roll of her eyes that always made me feel 12 years old again. But none of it was there. Only silence. Michael looked up from the altar, his face lighting the way it always did when he saw me. That smile, full and unguarded, steadied me for a second. Guests turned to admire me, some even gasped softly, but all I felt was the hollow pull of those empty chairs. Each step forward was a battle between dignity and despair. I forced my chin higher, tried to let the music carry me. To everyone else, it was a beautiful wedding, a bride walking toward her future. Inside, it felt like a performance where the lead cast had abandoned the stage. A little girl sitting near the aisle whispered to her mother, pointing at me, eyes wide with wonder. Her innocence should have warmed me, but instead it struck something raw. I had been that little girl once, looking for approval from people who would never give it. When I reached the altar, Michael reached for my hand. His fingers pressed into mine, steady, grounding. The officiant smiled warmly, and the guests leaned forward, but the echo of absence screamed louder than anything else. During the vows, my voice trembled, not from nerves but from the effort of keeping back tears that had nothing to do with joy. Michael's words were strong and sure, filled with love and promises. Mine came out softer, broken in places, but he didn't flinch. He just looked at me as though he understood what no one else in that room could. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the room erupted in applause, cheers ringing against the glass ceiling. I smiled for them, for the cameras, for the friends who had traveled, and the colleagues who believed in me. I smiled because it was expected, but inside I felt the cut of those 4 rows like a blade. As we walked back down the aisle together, hands linked, petals floating through the air, I heard the joy around me and knew it should have been enough. Yet behind every laugh and cheer was the shadow of what was missing. It wasn't just about their absence, it was the choice they had made, deliberate and final. Outside, the sunlight poured down warm on my shoulders, but the emptiness in me was heavier than the silk dress I wore. Guests crowded around with hugs and congratulations, glasses of champagne waiting on silver trays. I let them celebrate, accepted their joy with practiced grace, but each time I glanced back toward the conservatory doors, I saw it again in my mind. 4 pristine rows, a silent declaration that I had been left behind by the people who should have been my first supporters. I kissed Michael when the photographer asked, smiled when friends clapped me on the back, laughed when his aunt dabbed at her eyes. But when I caught my reflection in a mirror propped against the garden wall, I saw the truth flicker across my face. A bride, yes. A woman loved deeply, yes. But also a daughter abandoned, a sister, erased standing in the glow of a day that should have been whole but wasn't. That image stayed with me as the reception began. The music rose, champagne flowed, and the crowd carried on in celebration. Yet every time I turned my head toward the dance floor, every toast I raised, every polite thank you that slipped from my lips, the emptiness followed me. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead, it became the day I learned exactly how much silence could hurt. The ache that followed me from the wedding doors carried me back to the house in Columbus where everything had started. Our home looked perfect from the outside, a neat two-story place with trimmed hedges and a fresh coat of paint that my father insisted on keeping spotless. Inside, perfection cracked along the walls. My mother, Karen, had a way of making Emily the center of every room, every conversation, every plan. It was as if Emily's smile was the currency of our family and the rest of us had to pay to keep it bright. When I was 10, I stayed up late practicing spelling words until my eyes blurred. I came down the stairs the next morning, clutching a certificate I had won in school, but the kitchen was filled with chatter about Emily's dance recital. My mother adjusted the bow in Emily's hair while barely glancing at the paper in my hand. I remember folding it quietly, sliding it under a book on the counter, pretending it didn't matter. My father, Richard, cared less about Emily's grades or recitals, but he was obsessed with how the family looked from the outside. The perfect Christmas photo, the perfect impression at church, the perfect smile for neighbors passing by. I learned early that his approval depended on how well I blended into the background, never distracting from the image he curated. Years later, when I earned a full scholarship to Ohio State University, it should have been a day worth remembering. The auditorium was packed, students lined up in their gowns, parents filling the seats with cameras ready. I scanned the crowd more times than I could count, convinced I would see my parents' faces shining with pride. They had promised they would come. But as names were called and applause rippled across the room, their seats stayed empty. Later that evening, I learned where they had gone. Emily had booked a photography session downtown, something about headshots for her modeling portfolio, and my parents had decided it was more important to attend. I smiled stiffly when classmates asked where my family was, brushing it off with lies about traffic. Inside, it felt like the ground had slipped away beneath me. The memory still burns sharp. I stood on that stage holding the certificate cameras, flashing professors, shaking my hand, and all I could hear was the absence of the voices I craved most. No mom calling out my name, no dad clapping louder than the rest. Just silence again, and a chair with no one sitting in it. Hannah was the one constant through all of it. She lived 3 houses down, and from the moment we met in kindergarten, she became the sister I wished I had. She was there that night when I got home from the ceremony, sitting cross-legged on my bedroom floor eating popcorn from the bag, ready to listen. She let me cry until my throat ached, and then swore she would never leave me standing alone the way they had. Hannah saw things no one else did. She knew the sting of walking into our kitchen only to hear my mother gushing about Emily's hair, Emily's grades, Emily's friends. She had been there the day I got my driver's license when my father tossed the keys to Emily instead because he thought she should have the first try. Hannah whispered under her breath that one day I would outgrow all of them, that one day they would regret not seeing me. Her loyalty carried me through years of feeling invisible. She drove with me to campus when I was scared of moving into the dorms, carried boxes up 3 flights of stairs without a complaint, and promised she would come back every weekend. She meant it too. When I stumbled through my first heartbreak, when professors tore apart my papers, when the loneliness of being overlooked threatened to swallow me, she was there. Yet, even with Hannah's steady presence, I could not erase the scenes that replayed in my mind. I remembered the exact sound of Emily laughing on the porch with my parents while I sat upstairs studying. I remembered birthdays where Emily blew out candles while my gift sat unopened in the corner. The weight of those small betrayals stacked higher each year until they pressed down on me in ways I didn't fully understand. Sometimes I wondered if I had been born into the wrong family entirely, as if some clerical mistake had dropped me into the Bennett household where Emily belonged, and I did not. The thought was cruel, but it was the only way to explain the distance that never closed, no matter how hard I tried. The night after the scholarship ceremony, I overheard my mother on the phone with an aunt. She said Emily's photos had turned out beautifully, that the photographer thought she had real potential. I stood in the hallway holding the medal the university had given me and realized my achievements would never weigh as much in their eyes as a single picture of Emily smiling. Those moments hardened into scars, each one shaping the woman who would one day stand at her wedding and feel the cut of 4 empty rows. They were not new wounds. They were reminders of every time I had reached for them and found nothing but air. As the music played on at my own reception and laughter spilled across the garden, I carried those memories like stones in my chest. The pride I had once tried to earn was never coming not from them. And deep down I knew it had never really been about me at all. It had always been about Emily, and I had only ever been a shadow in her light. Michael had been the one person who never let me question my worth. From the first time we met at a small coffee shop near the Ohio State campus, his eyes carried none of the dismissiveness I had grown used to. He was a software engineer, practical and steady, the kind of man who noticed the little things and remembered them. When I doubted myself, he would look at me as if I were the most certain thing in the room. Planning a wedding with him should have been filled with joy. We chose Franklin Park Conservatory in Columbus because the glass ceilings reminded me of endless light of possibilities I still wanted to believe in. When the invitations were printed, Michael and I sat together at the kitchen table, carefully sealing each envelope. His parents called within days, thrilled, already talking about flights and hotel rooms. My family's responses came in shadows. I mailed the card to my parents first. A week later, my phone rang. My mother's voice was clipped like she was calling from a place she did not want to be. She said, "We got it, we will see." No excitement, no congratulations. Not even a simple question about Michael. My father did not call at all. When I finally reached him days later, he mumbled something about work being busy, his words drifting like smoke gone before I could hold on to them. I sent Emily hers by courier, hand delivering it felt like more than I could handle. Days turned into weeks without a word. No text, no call, not even a half-hearted acknowledgement that I was about to begin a new chapter of my life. Hannah, who once promised never to leave me standing alone, hesitated in ways I could not ignore. She changed the subject when I mentioned the wedding, claimed she was busy when I asked her to help with plans. Her silences cut deeper than outright rejection. The only flicker of warmth came from Maggie, a cousin I rarely saw. She lived in Cincinnati and had her own busy life, but when she called me, her voice carried genuine happiness. She said she could not wait to come, that someone in the family needed to show up for me. It was a small spark, but it mattered. I tried to drown out the ache with fittings, tastings, and flowers, Michael beside me at every appointment. He joked with the tailor, offered to sample every cake, and squeezed my hand whenever he caught my smile faltering. He kept reminding me that this was our day, that love was not measured by how many relatives filled the seats. Still, I carried the weight of every empty promise. Then August arrived and Emily made her announcement. It came like thunder rolling across a quiet sky. Her engagement was declared with glossy photos on social media, a glittering diamond held up to the camera, her fiancé's arm draped around her shoulders. My parents commented within minutes, long paragraphs about how proud they were, how radiant she looked. The real blow came a week later when invitations for Emily's engagement party landed in mailboxes across the family. The date, written in gold lettering, was the exact same day Michael and I had set for our wedding. It felt deliberate, like a blade slid clean between my ribs. When I showed Michael, my hands shook. He read it twice, his jaw tightening, and said, "Of course she did." The fallout spread quickly. Relatives who had wavered on attending our wedding suddenly sent polite regrets, explaining they could not miss Emily's big moment. Friends of my parents called to say they had been invited to her party, voices tinged with embarrassment when they realized it clashed with my ceremony. Even Hannah posted a picture of Emily trying on dresses captioned with hearts. I told myself it was coincidence, that maybe Emily had not realized. But deep down I knew. She had always known how to turn the spotlight toward herself, and my wedding was no exception. I sat in the living room staring at her invitation, the date seared into my mind. Michael knelt beside me, his hand covering mine, and whispered that we would walk through this together. His certainty kept me upright, even as the silence from my family grew louder. As the weeks passed, I noticed how quickly the narrative shifted. My parents spoke of Emily's engagement as if it were the only event that mattered. When I called my mother to remind her of our ceremony, she sighed and said she would try to make both work, though her tone carried no conviction. My father avoided the subject entirely. It was as if they had decided one daughter's love was worth celebrating while the other's was an afterthought. I spent nights lying awake beside Michael, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many chairs would sit empty on the day I walked down the aisle. I had imagined family laughter, childhood memories blending with new beginnings. Instead, all I could see were rows of vacant seats, the same silence that had haunted me since childhood stretching into the most important day of my life. By the time fall crept in, I no longer expected calls or warm wishes. The truth had settled heavy in my chest. My wedding would not be the union of families, not the blending of two circles into one. It would be a line drawn sharp between those who stood with me and those who chose not to. And as much as it broke me, I began to understand that love could not be forced into places it had never existed. The air inside the conservatory was sweet with the smell of roses and buttercream, the music soft and golden as Michael and I stood hand in hand before the cake. It was tall and elegant, 3 tiers of white with delicate sugar flowers curling along the sides. Our friends clapped and cheered when we picked up the knife together. For a moment, I let myself breathe in the joy of it, the laughter, the sound of glasses clinking, the way the lights shimmered across the glass ceiling. Then my phone began to vibrate against the table beside me. Once. Twice. Then again, insistent. I ignored it at first, thinking maybe it was a late guest who had lost their way. But the buzzing never stopped. Every time I set the knife down to steady my hand, it hummed again like it was clawing at my attention. When the first slice of cake was on the plate and Michael lifted it toward me, I risked a glance. My screen glowed with missed calls, one after another, all from the same number. My mother's name flashed like a warning I couldn't silence. 25 missed calls in less than an hour. The red notification bubble was stacked with texts. My chest tightened. What could possibly justify this on my wedding day? I tried to push it aside, smile for the cameras, lean into Michael's hand as he brushed a crumb from my lip. But the unease was a shadow that clung to me, whispering that something was wrong. I excused myself and slipped to the side of the room where the music was muffled and the guests were lost in their own conversations. My hand trembled as I unlocked the phone. The text came in sharp bursts. "Where are you? You think this is funny? How could you? Answer me now." My mother's words were frantic, almost angry, as if I had done something to her, not the other way around. Then Maggie's name appeared on the screen. She wasn't one to call without reason, and when I answered, her voice spilled out fast and uneven. "Clara, oh my God, you need to know what's happening." I pressed my hand to my ear, straining to catch every word over the background noise of my own reception. "She said she was at Emily's engagement party." My stomach dropped before she even finished the sentence. I could hear the din of voices behind her glasses clinking, the thrum of celebration. Maggie's voice shook as she told me what she'd just overheard. Our parents were standing in the center of the crowd, telling everyone that I had scheduled my wedding on Emily's big day out of spite. They were calling me selfish, dramatic, desperate to upstage my sister. The room around me blurred. My knees felt weak, the floor tilting under my shoes. Even here, even in the one place that was supposed to belong to me, they had found a way to drag me into their story, to paint me as the villain in front of people I had never even met. Maggie kept talking, her words rushing together. She said guests were whispering, shaking their heads, some even saying they felt sorry for Emily having a sister like me. I leaned against the wall, gripping my phone so hard my knuckles ached. The sound of laughter from my reception hall drifted toward me, cruelly out of sync with the storm Maggie described. I whispered thank you to her, though my throat was raw. She begged me not to let it ruin my day, said she would defend me to anyone who listened. But the damage was already done. My own parents had stood in front of strangers and chosen humiliation for me over silence. When I returned to the table, Michael caught my face immediately. He knew. He always knew. He pulled me aside, away from the flash of cameras, and asked what had happened. I told him in a voice so low it barely carried. His jaw set, his hand tightening around mine, anger simmering beneath the calm he tried to hold for me. We rejoined. The guests smiled when asked, posed for photos, but I felt like I was moving through fog. Each laugh, each cheer seemed to echo the whispers I couldn't hear but could imagine. Selfish, jealous. A shadow clawing for light. Later, when the band played our song, and Michael pulled me close, I let my head rest against his chest, but my eyes stayed fixed on those empty rows of chairs near the front. 4 long rows reserved for a family who had chosen not only to abandon me but to weaponize my absence. The night stretched on, and though I danced, though I thanked friends for coming, though I held Michael's hand as if it were the only thing anchoring me, the truth pressed harder against my ribs. On the day meant to celebrate love, I was still being cast as a rival. And I knew this wasn't the end. If they could tarnish me here on this night, they would not stop. I walked out onto the terrace for air, the city lights flickering against the glass walls. The phone was still heavy in my hand, the unanswered messages sitting there like stones. I thought of Maggie in that crowded room, standing alone as she listened to the lies unravel. I thought of my parents smiling as they slandered me to applause. Inside, Michael was waiting, his smile steady, his arms ready. But outside, beneath the night sky, I felt the split more clearly than ever. My wedding had not only revealed who stood with me, it had revealed how far my own blood would go to erase me. The cool air wrapped around me as I stood on the terrace, my phone still warm in my hand from Maggie's call. I thought she might let me breathe for a while, give me a moment to collect myself, but the screen lit up again. This time it wasn't another call. It was a message. I opened it, and the picture that filled the screen made my breath stop short. Emily stood in the center of the engagement party, a glass raised in her hand, her lips caught mid-laugh. Her dress was white, not just ivory or champagne, but a bold bridal white that shimmered under the lights. Around her neck hung a diamond that seemed to catch every glint of the chandelier above. I knew it instantly, the way you recognize something tied to your own blood. Carter's tear. My grandmother's necklace. The sight of it felt like ice in my chest. That necklace had been the only heirloom my grandmother, June Carter, left behind specifically for me. In her will written in 2018, she had written my name with such care, as if she wanted to make sure no one could mistake her wishes. She had said it belonged to me, that it was meant to remind me of her strength and her love, that it was a piece of her heart I could carry into every chapter of my life. I remembered the day my mother told me it was gone. She had said it casually in the kitchen one evening, her back turned as she washed dishes. The clasp broke, she said, and the diamonds had loosened. Too costly to repair, better to let it go. At the time I believed her, even though something in me wondered why no one had thought to at least show me what was left. But the trust I had then felt like a foolish child's hand placed in fire. Now I saw the truth glittering on Emily's throat, worn as if it had always belonged to her, displayed to a roomful of people who would never know the betrayal etched into every facet of that diamond. I wanted to scream, to hurl the phone into the night, to shatter something just to match the way my insides felt. But I couldn't move. Michael slipped out behind me, his hand brushing my arm. "Clara, are you all right?" he asked softly. I tilted the screen toward him, unable to find the words. His eyes narrowed as he recognized what he was seeing. "That's your grandmother's necklace, isn't it?" I nodded, the lump in my throat too heavy to let sound escape. He pulled me against him, his jaw tight with fury. "They stole it from you." His voice was low, dangerous. "They knew it was yours." I thought of my grandmother's hands, how they used to tremble when she fastened that very necklace around her own neck on Christmas Eve or Easter Sunday. She used to say it was a piece of history, something carved out of sacrifice and grit, passed down through her family, so that the women who wore it would always know they came from strength. She had looked at me once, her voice frail but steady, and told me it would be mine one day. And now, instead of keeping her promise alive, my parents had buried it in lies, feeding me stories about broken clasps and repair costs, all so Emily could drape herself in what was never hers. They hadn't just stolen jewelry. They had stolen my grandmother's voice, her memory, her final gift to me. Maggie texted again, her words tumbling across the screen. "I'm so sorry, Clara." I couldn't stop staring at it. I wanted to rip it off her neck. "Your mom is telling people it was always Emily's." The fury inside me turned sharp. Always Emily's. as if I had been erased from the will, from memory, from the truth itself. It wasn't enough that they hadn't come to my wedding. It wasn't enough that they had lied to guests about me. Now they were rewriting history, twisting even the dead's wishes to make sure Emily shone while I disappeared. Michael's hand stayed firm against my back, but I felt my whole body stiffen with a cold clarity. I thought I had known betrayal, but this was different. This wasn't just about favoritism or missed ceremonies or cold shoulders. This was theft. It was deliberate, planned, and cruel. The music from inside drifted faintly through the glass, people laughing and calling for us to dance. I should have gone back in. I should have let the night belong to the joy we had built. But my heart was elsewhere, trapped in the photograph of Emily's smile in the diamonds that had once been a promise to me. I scrolled back through the messages, reading my mother's frantic words again, now clearer in their meaning. Answer me now. Where are you? You think this is funny? She wasn't panicking because she missed me. She was panicking because she knew the picture would make its way to me, because the lie she had spun was unraveling. Michael kissed the top of my head, grounding me, but even his warmth couldn't push away the ache. I locked the phone and held it against my chest, closing my eyes. For years, I had swallowed the slights, the favoritism, the empty seats, the laughter at my expense. But this was different. This was mine, and they had stolen it. Inside, my guests were waiting. Outside, I stood in the shadows with the truth pressed against my ribs. I knew in that moment that nothing between us would ever be the same again. Back at the hotel, the satin of my gown dragged softly against the carpet as I closed the door behind me. The room smelled faintly of roses from the bouquet I had set on the dresser earlier that day, but the sweetness turned cloying now. I slipped into the bathroom, the only place that felt small enough to hold the storm inside me. The tile was cold through the thin soles of my shoes as I lowered myself onto the edge of the tub, my phone gripped tight in my hand. The voicemail icon blinked insistently, a red reminder I could not ignore. I pressed play, holding the phone close. My mother's voice filled the silence, familiar and foreign all at once. Clara, this is your mother. I wanted to call and say congratulations. The words sounded stiff, as if she had plucked them from a script. Her tone shifted quickly, clipped, practical. I also wanted to tell you I gave the necklace to Emily. It looked so perfect on her, and I didn't think you would mind. Don't make a fuss about it. It's only jewelry after all. I felt my throat tighten, but the message kept rolling on. You should really try to be supportive. Emily's engagement is such a big moment for our family. By the way, could you help order an additional cake for her party? They underestimated the guest list, and you're so good with those details. Call me back when you can. The voicemail ended with a faint click, leaving me staring at the dark screen as if it might offer some other explanation. My hands shook as I replayed it, listening again to the breezy way she dismissed what had been promised to me, what my grandmother had pressed into the fabric of her will. Only jewelry. The phrase cut deeper than any outright insult could have. The diamonds weren't only jewelry, they were my grandmother's hands fastening the clasp behind my neck in the mirror of her bedroom when I was 8. They were her laughter when I asked if I could wear it to a school play. They were her final words about strength and dignity written carefully into her will. My mother had stripped all of that away, reduced it to a trinket she could pass along to Emily without hesitation. Tears blurred my vision, but I refused to let them fall. Instead, I pressed record, saving the voicemail to a separate folder. My thumb hovered for a moment before labeling it simply, evidence. I sat there in silence, the dress pooling around me like some forgotten costume, and scrolled through the photos Maggie had sent. Emily's smile, the necklace catching the light, the crowd clapping around her. Then I scrolled through the texts from my mother, the frantic demands, the threats wrapped in maternal authority. I saved them all one by one, creating a trail that could not be denied. Michael knocked gently on the door. Clara, are you all right? I cleared my throat, forcing my voice steady. I just need a minute. He didn't press. That was one of the things I loved most about him. He knew when to hold me close and when to let me breathe. When the silence stretched again, I let my head fall into my hands. The weight of the gown pressed down on my shoulders, the sequins scratching against my skin, but I didn't move to change. I wanted to feel every ounce of discomfort as if the fabric could anchor me in the reality of what had just happened. For so long, I had told myself their slights were misunderstandings, their neglect unintentional. But this was deliberate. My mother's own words sealed it. She had taken what was mine and given it away, then asked me to help polish Emily's celebration, as if I were nothing more than an event planner hired to serve. I replayed the voicemail once more, each word striking harder than the last. The hollow congratulations, the dismissal, the request. By the third time, my tears had dried into something colder. The ache inside me sharpened into resolve. I would not confront them tonight, not in this gown, not while the echoes of my own vows still hung in the air. But I would not forget, and I would not forgive. The evidence I had saved was only the beginning. I locked my phone and set it on the sink, the glass counter catching the pale glow of the chandelier overhead. My reflection in the mirror startled me. The makeup had smudged at the corners of my eyes, but beneath it my face was steady, almost calm. I looked like a woman who had lost something precious, yes, but also like a woman who was beginning to understand exactly what she had to do next. The hum of the city outside filtered faintly through the window. Life went on, cars moving, people laughing, the world unaware that one family had just cut itself in two. I inhaled deeply, my chest rising and falling with a rhythm that no longer felt fragile. I gathered the train of my dress and stood, the lace brushing against the cool tile. One step toward the door, one step back to the world that waited beyond this bathroom. My decision was already made. If I could not be their daughter in love, then I would be their reminder in truth. When I opened the door, the room was quiet except for the soft shuffle of Michael setting aside his jacket. He looked up at me, questions in his eyes, but he didn't ask them. I crossed the room and slipped into his arms, the only place left where I still belonged. In the silence that followed, I knew one thing for certain. They had taken too much already, and I would never let them take anything from me again. After the wedding, I shut the door on my family and left it locked. Calls went unanswered, texts unopened. Their numbers remained stored in my phone, but every time one lit up the screen, I let it ring into silence. Instead, I poured myself into work, the only place where effort actually meant results. At the Ohio Women's Health Network, my title was Program Coordinator, but in truth, I lived and breathed the mission. Mornings started early with grant applications and conference calls, afternoons with site visits to clinics across Franklin County. The long drives gave me time to think, sometimes too much, but at least the thoughts had direction. My colleagues noticed the intensity, though most assumed it came from ambition. Only Michael knew it came from survival. For months, I refused to bring up my family even to him. At night, when he asked how my day had gone, I recited lists of tasks, never the ache beneath them. He learned not to press, but he was there in other ways, filling the fridge with my favorite yogurt, making coffee before I woke, rubbing my shoulders when the weight of the world seemed to sit there permanently. One evening in February, the ache took shape. I was preparing for a major presentation to the network's board, flipping through slides in the dim light of my office when a colleague stopped by. His tone was hesitant, the kind people use when repeating gossip they half believe. He said there had been murmurs, something about me being difficult, even disruptive, and that the board might be uneasy. My stomach tightened. I knew the source before he even spoke the name. Hannah. She had always been close to Emily, and though she had once sworn loyalty to me, her silence on my wedding day had been deafening. Now it seemed she had chosen her side fully. When I stepped into the boardroom that Friday morning, the tension was already there. 12 members sat at the long mahogany table, their folders lined neatly in front of them. The president, Dr. Avery, smiled politely, but her eyes flicked to the man seated at the far end. His expression was cool, skeptical, and when he finally spoke, it was with the exact phrasing my colleague had warned me about. Some concerns have been raised, Miss Bennett, about your ability to collaborate constructively. Can you speak to that? The words landed like a slap. For a moment, the old Clara threatened to crumble, the one who used to beg for approval and shrivel when it was withheld. But then I remembered my mother's voicemail, the necklace on Emily's neck, the empty rose at my wedding. Something inside me steeled. I straightened my shoulders and met his eyes. Collaboration is not the same as submission, I said. What I bring to this network is not disruption but accountability. I turned on the projector, clicked the first slide, and let the numbers do the talking. For the next 40 minutes, I walked them through data on maternal health outcomes, the gaps in funding, and the communities most at risk. I showed charts, told stories of patients whose lives had shifted because of small but crucial interventions, and tied every detail back to the program I had designed. My voice didn't shake once. By the time I finished, the room was silent. Not the silence of disapproval, but the silence of people recalibrating what they thought they knew. Finally, Dr. Avery leaned forward, her tone measured but warm. "Thank you, Clara. That was compelling." The skeptical board member cleared his throat, avoiding my gaze. "I suppose we will need to consider allocating resources accordingly." When the vote came, it was unanimous. The network would approve a grant of $2 million to launch the program statewide. The weight that lifted from my chest was not just relief, but vindication. For the first time, I had turned the narrative on its head. That evening, Michael threw together a backyard dinner with our closest friends. The grill smoked, the sound of laughter carried over the fence, and someone uncorked a bottle of wine we had been saving. Sitting there, under string lights, the night air cool against my skin, I looked around at the faces gathered. These were not people bound to me by blood, but by choice. My chosen family. Sunday dinners became a ritual after that. Sometimes it was pot roast, sometimes simple pasta, but always the same circle of support. No silent judgments, no shifting loyalties. Just people who showed up week after week because they wanted to. One Sunday, Maggie joined us, her presence, a quiet bridge to the past. She squeezed my hand across the table, her eyes filled with apology she didn't need to speak. We were both learning what it meant to carve a life separate from the expectations we were born into. At work, my confidence grew. When I walked into meetings now, I didn't shrink into corners. I claimed space. The rumor Hannah had seeded lost its power, replaced by the results I delivered. And in private moments, when doubt tried to creep back in, I reminded myself of that boardroom, the hush that followed my final slide, the look on the skeptic's face when the vote turned in my favor. Standing there had felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, wind battering me from all sides. But instead of falling, I had planted my feet, lifted my chin, and turned the gale into proof of my strength. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to protect myself, not by hiding, but by speaking, by standing tall, by refusing to be erased. And once I had felt that, I knew I would never go back. Late one evening, after another long day at the office, I found myself sitting cross-legged on the living room floor with an old cardboard box pulled from the back of my closet. It was the box I had carried with me through every apartment, every move, and every season since Grandma June passed. For months I had avoided it, telling myself I didn't have the time or the strength to look. But that night, with Michael already asleep and the house quiet except for the hum of the fridge, I felt the urge to finally open it. Inside were envelopes, yellowed at the edges, recipe cards written in her neat cursive, a stack of photographs bound with a rubber band that had nearly snapped. I sifted through them slowly, letting the scent of lavender sachets she used to tuck in drawers fill my memory. At the bottom, beneath a pile of church bulletins and greeting cards, I found a manila folder. My hands shook as I pulled it out. I knew what it was before I even opened it. Grandma's legal documents. There, sandwiched between insurance forms and medical bills, was a scan of her will dated 2018. I spread it open on the floor, my heart pounding, and read each line carefully. When I reached the section marked personal effects, my breath caught. It was written in black ink, perfectly clear. The diamond necklace, known as Carter's Tear, shall be given to my granddaughter Clara Bennett on the occasion of her wedding day. It was not vague, not implied, not up for interpretation. It was mine. For years my mother had told me the necklace was broken, that it had been tucked away, unusable, lost to time. And yet there it was, written into Grandma's wishes with absolute clarity. My chest tightened with a mixture of rage and vindication. I sat there on the rug, staring at the words until they blurred. At last I had proof that I had not been imagining things, that I had not been selfish or demanding. It had been promised to me legally and lovingly. As if the universe wanted to sharpen the blade further, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Maggie. She had been sorting through old files of her own, she said, and had come across something that might matter. Attached was a photo of a signed document dated June 2022. My mother's signature sat at the bottom in blue ink. The text above was brief and chilling. Loan of necklace Carter's tear to daughter Emily Bennett for engagement celebration. Must be returned to estate holder Clara Bennett after event. The room tilted. I read it again, then a third time. Loan. Must be returned. It wasn't even an oversight or a misunderstanding. They had known it was mine. They had acknowledged it in writing. And still Emily had draped it around her neck as though it belonged to her, parading it across a ballroom full of guests while my mother smiled beside her. I pressed my palm against my mouth, torn between laughter and tears. After all the lies, after all the years of being told I was dramatic or difficult here, it was in black and white. Proof that I had been wronged not once, but deliberately. My first instinct was to call Michael to wake him and show him what I had found. But I stopped myself. Instead, I sat in the quiet, letting the paper rest against my knees, letting the weight of it settle. For the first time since my wedding, I felt the power shift. I was no longer the girl begging to be seen. I was the woman holding the evidence they had hoped I would never discover. I tucked both documents carefully into a new folder, labeling it in bold letters legal. Then I placed the folder in our safe, locking it behind steel and combination. My hands were steady now, my breath even. The next morning over coffee, I slid the folder across the kitchen table to Michael. He opened it, scanned the pages, and looked up at me with a slow nod. "This changes everything," he said. "I know," I whispered. For the rest of the week, I carried myself differently. At work, my colleagues noticed the calm confidence in my stride. At dinner with friends, I laughed more easily, no longer weighed down by the endless cycle of doubt. Inside, something fundamental had shifted. I was not powerless anymore. I had proof. And with proof came the ability to act, not just to endure. That night, I sat at my desk with a fresh notebook and began outlining every piece of evidence I had collected over the past year. The voicemail from my mother, the photographs Maggie had sent, the texts, and now the will and loan document. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed into something undeniable. For so long they had painted me as unstable, as jealous, as the sister who couldn't let things go. Now I had the paper trail to show otherwise. And though I had no immediate plan for what to do with it, I felt stronger simply knowing it was mine to hold. The ache of betrayal had not vanished, but it no longer hollowed me out. It fueled me. Every line of Grandma's handwriting reminded me that she had seen me, valued me, and chosen me. They could lie, they could twist, they could exclude, but they could not erase the truth written in her will. When I finally closed the notebook and turned off the desk lamp, I felt a steady hum in my chest. It was not joy, not quite relief, but something firmer. Resolve. And as I climbed into bed beside Michael, sliding under the quilt Grandma herself had sewn, I knew the balance of power had shifted forever. The following Monday, I walked into a law office in downtown Columbus, with the folder clutched tight against my ribs. The brass letters on the glass door read Vincent Gray, attorney at law, and the moment I stepped inside, I felt the hush of old wood and quiet power. The receptionist offered me water, but my throat was too dry to take it. Minutes later, I was ushered into a corner office where shelves of thick books lined the walls and framed diplomas hung neatly above a leather chair. Vincent Gray was older than I expected, with silver hair brushed back and a voice that carried both patience and weight. He motioned for me to sit and asked calmly what had brought me there. My hands trembled only once as I slid the folder across his desk. I told him everything. The will. The loan document. The necklace displayed at my sister's engagement party. The voicemail from my mother. I spoke carefully, steadying myself when anger threatened to crack my voice. Vincent listened without interrupting, his eyes scanning the pages, his pen tapping against his notepad. When I finished, the room felt still. He adjusted his glasses and leaned back. "This is not ambiguous," he said firmly. "Your grandmother's will gives you full ownership. The document your mother signed makes it clear the necklace was only loaned to your sister. Keeping it now is unlawful possession of inherited property." The words settled deep in my chest, sharp but solid. Unlawful possession. For years I had been made to feel petty, childish, dramatic. And now here was a lawyer telling me the truth was not only valid but legally undeniable. He looked at me closely. The question is, Clara, how do you want to proceed? We can request its return quietly through formal notice without public attention. Or we can file openly and it will be a matter of record. It will not stay hidden. I thought of my mother's voicemail telling me not to make a fuss. I thought of my father standing silent while Emily wore what was mine. I thought of the laughter in that engagement hall, guests clapping as Emily sparkled in my necklace. For once, silence was not an option. I lifted my chin and met his gaze. I want it public. Vincent nodded once as though he had expected that. Then we will begin. When I left his office, the sunlight on High Street felt different. The air was crisp, early spring cutting across my skin, and yet I felt warmer than I had in months. My steps were steady, each one carrying the weight of a decision I could not take back. I no longer carried only pain. I carried purpose. That weekend, I attended a charity gala at the Franklin Park Conservatory, one of those events where women in sequins balanced champagne flutes and men spoke too loudly about golf. Normally, I would have stood in the corner making polite conversation and leaving early. But Michael encouraged me to go, reminding me that not every room was hostile, that some doors could open to allies. It was there I met Phoebe Lane. She was younger than most of the donors, her dress simple compared to the glittering gowns around her. But she had a presence that drew people and a curiosity that made her eyes light up when she listened. We found ourselves side by side at the silent auction table, both pretending to debate on bidding for a weekend in Hocking Hills. She asked what I did, and when I told her about my work at Ohio Women's Health Network, she smiled. I cover society and philanthropy for the Columbus Herald, she said. My job is to notice what people don't say out loud. Something in her tone made me pause. She leaned in slightly. The best stories are the ones hidden just beneath the chandeliers. I sipped my drink, the bubbles catching in my throat. I didn't spill my secrets, not then, but I let slip a thread. Families are complicated, I said quietly. Especially when inheritance and reputation mix. Her eyes sharpened, but she didn't press. Instead, she told me about her father's business that had crumbled because of backroom deals and how she had promised herself never to look away from hypocrisy, dressed in pearls. She laughed, then soft and genuine, and I found myself relaxing in her company. When the auction ended, she scribbled her number on the back of the program and pressed it into my hand. For coffee, she said. For the stories no one else wants to hear. That night, as I laid the program on my dresser, I realized I had found something rare. A friend who might one day help me shine light where my family had only cast shadows. Driving home from Vincent's office earlier that week had given me resolve. Meeting Phoebe gave me perspective. Alone I could fight. But with the right allies, I could win. By the time the weekend faded, I had tucked both the lawyer's business card and Phoebe's number into the same place in my wallet. Different tools, different paths, but both leading to one outcome. I would not let them write the ending to this story. As I closed the folder again late Sunday evening, my reflection in the darkened window staring back at me, I whispered it out loud for the first time. No more silence. Summer heat clung to the streets of Cleveland as the city buzzed with whispers of the Harper wedding. Emily's engagement had already made the society pages, and now her ceremony at Harper Mansion was set to be the spectacle of the season. The mansion rose like a palace on the lakefront, draped in flowers and satin ribbons, limousines sliding to a stop under the carved stone archway. Photographers in black suits swarmed the steps, their cameras flashing each time a guest stepped out. I was not invited, of course. My name had been erased from the guest list months ago, but I did not need a seat at one of the glittering tables to make my presence known. My work had been done in quiet meetings, in the signing of legal documents, in the weight of my attorney's voice, as he assured me the law was clear. On the morning of the wedding, I received a message from Maggie. Short, almost hurried. Jewelry photos scheduled at 2:15 the bridal suite. Be ready. My heart thudded as I read it, the words carrying the force of everything I had carried since that night of my own reception. I tucked the phone away, steadying myself. Vincent had already prepared the documents. A formal demand for the return of inherited property signed and sealed, carrying enough legal weight to shake even the grandest ballroom. We had agreed it would not be handed to Emily directly. It would go to the people who ran the show, the planner, and the venue, those who understood liability better than loyalty. At precisely 2 o'clock, Vincent arrived at the mansion. He wore a dark suit despite the heat, his briefcase swinging at his side. No one questioned him as he crossed the manicured lawn as if authority itself had opened the door for him. Upstairs, the bridal suite was chaos. Hairsprays, hissed, makeup brushes swept, and Emily stood in front of a full-length mirror in her gown, satin pooling like spilled milk across the carpet. Around her, bridesmaids fluttered, fussing over hems and curls, their laughter filling the room. On the vanity lay the necklace, Carter's tear glinting cold under the bulbs. The photographer lifted his camera, preparing to capture the heirloom draped around Emily's neck. That was the moment Maggie had timed. Before the shutter clicked, the door opened. The planner stepped inside, her smile faltering as Vincent followed behind. In his hand was the letter. Quiet words passed between them, words I would later hear from Vincent himself. Legal dispute. Active claim. Potential litigation. He spoke evenly without threat, but every syllable carried consequence. The planner blanched, reading the letter again and again, her fingers trembling at the signature stamped below. The mood in the room shifted, unease crackling through the air. Emily spun around, her veil whipping. What is this? She demanded. What's going on? The planner's voice broke. We can't photograph the necklace. There's a legal issue. Liability risk. We have to remove it. Emily's face flushed scarlet, her hands flying to her throat as if to shield the diamonds. She laughed, sharp and brittle. This is ridiculous. It's mine. My mother gave it to me. Vincent's voice was calm. Your mother cannot give what was never hers to give. The bridesmaids froze, mascara wands and curling irons suspended midair. Maggie, pressed against the wall, held her breath. And then Emily screamed. The sound was raw, breaking through the layers of perfume and piano music floating in from the hall. She ripped the bouquet from a maid's hands and flung it across the room, petals scattering like confetti on the carpet. Tears welled in her eyes, fury twisting her features. She clawed at the clasp, yanking the necklace free so violently it left a red mark along her collarbone. Her mother, pale as ash, rushed forward, whispering frantic words I could only imagine, but it was too late. Emily hurled the necklace into the air, the diamonds clattering against the vanity with a hollow sound. Gasps filled the suite. Outside, guests waiting in the foyer began to murmur as raised voices slipped through the heavy doors. The planner stooped quickly, scooping up the necklace, clutching it as if it might burn her. She looked at Vincent, then at Emily, and finally at the reflection of herself in the mirror. Her decision was made. We cannot proceed with this piece, she said firmly. Until the dispute is resolved, it cannot be worn. Emily's chest heaved, her gown trembling with every breath. Her bridesmaids gathered around, whispering frantically, but the damage had already been done. The spell of perfection had shattered, and in its place lay the truth gleaming cold on the vanity table. Downstairs, as guests sipped champagne and adjusted their fascinators, the whispers began. Something about the necklace. Something about the law. Some said it was stolen, others said it was cursed, but all agreed on one thing. The Harper wedding was not unfolding as planned. And while I sat miles away, the phone beside me silent for once, I could almost hear it. The crack in their perfect facade, the sound of control slipping from their grasp. The diamonds were no longer around Emily's throat. They were evidence, proof, a piece of me they could never erase again. The mansion's grand clock struck 3, the bells echoing over Lake Erie, and with it the balance shifted further. For the first time, it was not me standing cornered in the dark. It was them. By the time the last bell faded into the lake air, the whispers had already begun to spread like wildfire. Guests who had witnessed Emily's breakdown in the bridal suite carried fragments of the story into the ballroom, weaving it into something bigger with every retelling. Phones buzzed on tables, notifications piling up, photos leaking out faster than anyone could control. The first image that took hold came from a distant cousin, a girl barely out of college, who had captured Emily in her dress just before the ceremony. In the picture, Emily's makeup was flawless, her smile stiff, but what drew every eye was the absence of sparkle at her collarbone. The caption was harmless enough, 3 question marks under the photo. Still, those marks carried more weight than 1,000 accusations. By midnight, the image was circulating through private group chats, then spilling into public feeds. Cleveland's social circle thrived on gossip, and few stories traveled faster than a scandal inside one of its oldest families. The next morning, Phoebe Lane called me directly. I was standing in my kitchen, coffee cooling in my hands, when her voice slid through the receiver, sharp and energized. She told me her piece was already written, already scheduled. The headline read, "Not all that glitters belongs to the bride." She assured me she had kept my name out of it. The story was framed around the symbolism of stolen heirlooms, family greed, and the illusion of perfection that so many tried to sell with diamonds and lace. It was not just an article. It was a mirror tilted so the whole city could see. By noon, I knew it had landed. The Lakewood Philanthropy Guild. The circle where my parents had preened for years found themselves swarmed with calls. Karen and Thomas Bennett had always wrapped themselves in charity work, attending galas, sponsoring luncheons, shaking hands with local politicians. But the guild had no tolerance for tainted names. Within 48 hours, their smiling portraits vanished from the donor wall. Their names disappeared from event programs. For people like my parents, that kind of erasure was a death sentence. Emily's unraveling was different and more public. For years, she had cultivated her online presence, posing in borrowed clothes, tagging designers, crafting a life that shimmered brighter than it ever truly was. But sponsorships were fickle, dependent on flawless optics. By the end of the week, one brand announced the termination of her contract, citing their commitment to integrity. 2 others quietly pulled scheduled campaigns. A Los Angeles trip meant to cement her place in the influencer market evaporated overnight. Her carefully built world collapsed, not in flames but in silence, contracts rescinded, calls unreturned. Hannah's exposure came almost like an aftershock. At first, she moved quickly, trying to spin the story, pointing blame elsewhere, dismissing the rumors as exaggerations. But in public relations, credibility is oxygen, and hers leaked fast. Screenshots surfaced, timestamped emails, little fragments that painted her not as a fixer but as an instigator. She had seeded lies about me into circles that now saw her as toxic. Clients withdrew. Colleagues avoided her. By the end of the month, her name no longer held weight in the offices she had once ruled with easy confidence. I should have felt triumphant, but what settled over me was quieter. I sat in my office at the Ohio Women's Health Network, watching sunlight stretch across the floor, and realized the dominoes were falling without my push. All I had done was hold the line, refused to yield. The rest was gravity, truth catching up to those who thought it would never find them. Still, there was a moment that broke through my composure. It happened one evening when Vincent asked me to stop by his office. The city was hushed under twilight, and his desk lamp cast a golden glow against the dark windows. He said nothing at first, only slid a small black velvet box across the polished wood toward me. My fingers trembled as I lifted the lid. Carter's tear gleamed from its satin nest, the diamonds scattering shards of light that caught against my skin. I had imagined this moment 100 times, but the reality struck deeper. It was heavier than I remembered, heavier than any necklace should be, as if carrying the weight of promises made and broken, of silence, endured and finally shattered. For a long while, I could not breathe. My throat closed, eyes burning, as I traced the delicate setting with the tip of my finger. Vincent's voice broke the silence, calm and certain. "It is yours, Clara. Legally, rightfully, unequivocally." The words anchored me. I closed the lid gently, pressing my palm flat against the velvet. The necklace was not just jewelry. It was history, inheritance, proof that truth had a place even against years of lies. It was the return of something that had been stolen, not just from me but from the version of myself that had believed I was powerless. When I left his office, the city lights blinking across the skyline, I carried the box pressed tight against my chest. Each step felt steadier, rooted in something I had never known before. Justice, I realized, was not loud. It was not a parade or a roar. Sometimes it was the simple weight of a velvet box in your hand, the knowledge that you had not been erased after all. That night back home, I placed the box on my dresser. I opened it once more, letting the diamonds catch the lamplight scattering prisms across the room. The reflection danced on the walls, flickered across the quilt Grandma had sewn, glinted in the mirror until it almost seemed alive. I touched the pendant one more time, not to claim it but to acknowledge it, to let it remind me that I had survived and that the truth once buried now lived in the open. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe I was not carrying loss anymore. I was carrying proof, and it was enough. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick, deliberate, and every bit as sharp as words I never spoke. After the article, after the photographs, after Emily's public collapse, my parents began their campaign. Calls arrived in the middle of the night, emails thick with phrases like family name and dignity, letters on heavy stationery delivered by courier. When none of it earned a response, they turned to lawyers. The first letter I received demanded the return of Carter's tear to preserve family honor. The irony would have made me laugh if it had not been so bitter. I placed the envelope in a drawer unread beyond the first line. More followed, drafted in colder language, written to intimidate. I did not reply to a single one. Each silence was a choice, a refusal to step back into the script they had written for me since childhood. The more they pushed, the easier it became to ignore. Instead of answering, I poured myself into work. At the Ohio Women's Health Network, my projects expanded beyond what I once thought possible. With the grant secured, I built a mentorship program for young women entering nonprofit leadership. I traveled across the Midwest to speak on panels, to lead workshops, to help others navigate battles I had once fought alone. Reporters no longer called about the scandal. They called to profile my work, to ask about the future of women in leadership. One evening, a Cleveland newspaper ran a feature on me as a director shaping health access across the region. My picture appeared on the front page, smiling, clear-eyed, no longer shadowed by loss. My parents must have seen it, though they never admitted as much. The article made no mention of them, no mention of the mansion or the gala circuits they once prized. In public, their silence was as thick as mine, but I knew the difference. Mine was strength, theirs was ruin. Through it all, Michael stood beside me. He was steady in ways that made the chaos easier to bear. Sunday dinners with friends became ritual, a chosen family gathering around mismatched plates and backyard laughter. There I was, not the outcast daughter or the forgotten sister. I was simply Clara, whole and unbroken. When our first anniversary arrived, Michael surprised me. We had planned nothing elaborate, just dinner at our favorite little bistro near the lake. Afterward, back home, he disappeared into the bedroom for a moment, then returned with the velvet box I had placed on my dresser months before. He set it in my hands, his smile quiet but sure. I opened it slowly, the familiar diamonds catching the soft glow of the lamp. Carter's tear rested there waiting. Michael reached out, lifting the necklace gently, and asked if I wanted to wear it. For the first time I said yes. The clasp clicked softly at the back of my neck, and the pendant settled against my skin. It felt cool at first, then warm, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. Not a symbol of loss anymore, but of freedom reclaimed. Justice, survival, and the life I had built beyond the shadows of betrayal. I caught my reflection in the mirror across the room. No trace of the girl who once sat outside her sister's wedding in the cold, unseen and unwanted. Instead, a woman who had chosen silence not as surrender but as answer. Silence had carved space for me to breathe, to build, to rise. My parents still tried from time to time. A voicemail here, a letter there, always couched in language about unity, appearances, the need to protect what little reputation they clung to. I never responded. Each unanswered attempt was its own boundary, its own reminder that I no longer owed them anything. Emily, too, reached out once, a short email months later that began with excuses and ended with accusation. I deleted it without finishing. She had chosen her path just as I had chosen mine. By the end of that year, the shape of my life had shifted completely. I had colleagues who respected me, friends who loved me, a husband who stood with me, and a voice that finally belonged to me. The family that once erased me had been reduced to shadows at the edges of their own downfall. As I touched the diamond pendant that evening, I understood with finality what Grandma must have known when she left it to me. It was not about jewels or wealth or the shimmer of silver in photographs. It was about legacy, about knowing who you are when the world tries to tell you otherwise. They had abandoned me. They had humiliated me. They had written me out. But in the end, it was not me who had lost everything. It was them. And I had no need to say it out loud. My silence was the answer, and it spoke louder than any words I could ever give. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever faced betrayal from those closest to you, if you have ever had to build yourself anew when family turned their backs, I would love to hear your story too. Share your thoughts in the comments like this video if it spoke to you, and subscribe for more stories of justice, resilience, and the strength it takes to rise when no one expects you to.